Others will tell you what you can or can't do, but if you've forgotten, it's all up to you. You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my Foul Play February series. I'm Brooke Makenna, but this is a whole new series that I'm doing this month because you guys really enjoyed and supported my Wicked Winter back in December. So I decided for this month in February, I'm going to be posting every single day once again, so make sure you are subscribed, and if you want to thumbs up this video to tell me how excited you are or leave a comment down below, I would love that. But for today's case, it's going to be about the San Francisco witch killers. Now, some people say that these killers had a bond and a belief like a small cult, but most just say they were a killer couple that showed no remorse. So this case is going to be the first of Foul Play February, and if you have any requests, you can always leave them down below. Now let's get back to the story. It all began March 6th of 1981 in San Francisco, California, when a landlord of an apartment building had called a plumber for the routine check, and they went downstairs to the basement. They were looking around, and then they wanted to go inside the apartment that was also downstairs. There was an apartment in the basement that they wanted to look in, and so they went there, and instead of this being just a normal routine checkup, they found a body. It was 23-year-old Karen Barnes, and she had been an actress that moved to San Francisco to further her career, but she was now deceased in the kitchen. She was face down in a pool of blood, and it was shown that her skull had been crushed and she had been stabbed 13 times in the neck and face. She had been wrapped in a blanket and hidden in the basement, but there was no sign of forced injury, and money was still in her purse. She also had no signs of sexual assault, and so the police believed that with all of that evidence and how brutal the attack was, that it was done by someone she knew. When the coroner was brought in, he found an iron skillet in the kitchen, which he believed was one of the murder weapons, but the knife used was not found. When the rest of the apartment was searched, they found religious-type symbols painted all over the walls, which was strange enough, but then they found one of probably the most important pieces of evidence they could find. A name. And it wasn't Karen. It was Susan with a Z. And because they believed the killer was possibly someone that Karen knew, they began to talk to her friends and family to try to figure out who this Susan was. They were quickly informed that Susan was one of Karen's roommates along with her boyfriend Michael, Susan's boyfriend Michael. Their last name was Bear, and they had met at a bar one night and quickly became friends. You see, Karen was kind of a lost soul. She was trying to figure out where she fit in, and Michael and Susan were kind of the hippie type, the ones who didn't care. They were older than her, and they just seemed really intriguing to her. And when they met, Michael and Susan needed a place to live, and Karen invited them to stay with her. But Karen's mother informed police that Bear was not their last name. Karen had told her that their last name was actually Carson. Because of this, the police suspicion of them, of course, was heightened, and they immediately began looking for them, but they hadn't been seen since Karen was found. They began looking for murders that kind of mimicked it in the area, but they weren't finding anything. And after a while, they had exhausted all leads in Karen's case, and it was kind of just pushed to the side as an open case. The police, of course, had an inkling that Michael and Susan had fled the area, which they had done, to Alder Point, California. And in May of 1982, a man named Clark Stevens was reported missing. When the police went to look for his body, they actually found his remains in chicken fertilizer in the woods. And guess who his co-workers were? Michael and Susan, and now they were nowhere to be found. The police believed they had lost Michael and Susan again, these killers, and they wouldn't probably ever find them until their next kill. But luckily, an acquaintance in Los Angeles had seen Michael while he was hitchhiking, and an officer went to pick him up. But not because of these murders. He was actually being arrested because he looked like a rape suspect that was wanted in the area. So he was picked up and brought in, and he told them that his name was Richard Arata, and he was questioned. They took his mugshot and they sent it to this rape victim, who said that that was not the man, and so they let him go. Except then the officer who brought Michael in found a gun in his police car, and they believed that it had belonged to him, but they had already let him go, and they knew something was very wrong. And then in Alder Point, California, the police station had asked them if they could run tests on the gun, and sure enough, it matched the same bullets that were used on Clark Stevens, and that's when they knew they had let Michael Carson go. Months went by with no sign of Michael or Susan until January of 1983, when a man named John Charles Hellier, who was a 30-year-old friendly man and was driving his pickup truck when he noticed two hitchhikers. He actually turned around from where he was headed to pick them up and help them out. And not long after that, on US Route 101, he was shot dead. But thankfully there were plenty of witnesses, and they called the police immediately and told them what had just happened. They saw the man in the passenger seat holding a gun to the driver's head, and the driver was kind of swerving off to the side trying to get off, and eventually after a fight the passenger shot the driver, and then a woman passenger actually got into the driver's seat and drove away. The police officers were really quick. They sped up on him and it began a high-speed chase. Eventually, the pickup truck, the two hitchhiking passengers, drove into a ditch, and then once they realized they couldn't drive any farther, they ran into the woods, where they were finally caught. And little did police know, they had just caught Michael and Susan Carson. You see, Susan Carson was born Susan with an S Barnes in 1941. She lived with a really wealthy family, and she had a pretty normal upbringing until she started being very distant with everyone, and she started saying she was a psychic and having these visions and being very antisocial. She never really fit in as a kid, and eventually she married an older man when she was still quite young because that made her feel like she fit in a little bit more. At that time, she also began doing heavy drugs and also studying the Islamic religion, but only taking the pieces that she wanted from it, basically making her own religion out of certain things. She became a whole different person after this, it was said. She believed that as well, and that is when she decided to change her name from Susan with an S to Susan with a Z. Her husband didn't approve of these changes and actually wanted to divorce her, and they did, but Susan wasn't sad about this. She almost felt free. But at 35, she began having really strong psychic visions and saying that she needed a spiritual connection from a man, and that is when she met Michael Carson, who she believed she had brought to herself through these visions. Because Michael, who was born James Clifford Carson, born in Oklahoma in 1951, was perfect in her eyes. As a child, he grew up in a middle-class family. Everything was really okay for him in his life until he was bedridden for a rare bone disease. This caused him to read a ton of books, and he loved politics and religion, and he wasn't sad about having to sit there and read. He actually loved soaking up all that knowledge. But with that, it made him angry at the world and the way it worked. He became quite rebellious as he got older, but he still liked to study and learn more, and that is why he attended the University of Iowa. This is also where he met his first wife, Lynn, and they had a little girl named Jen or Jennifer. In 1975, they moved to Arizona so Lynn could be an English teacher and he could be a stay-at-home dad / pot dealer. But 2 years later, in 1977, things were getting very trying for the family. They were arguing all the time. They were either arguing about the fact that James didn't have a job or that his behavior had changed tremendously. And that is when Lynn actually got a divorce and took Jennifer with her. Not long after that is when he met Susan. And Susan began taking hallucinogenics with him, and they were just partying all the time, and it was an instant obsession between the two of them. And that is when Susan told him, "Your name is Michael, right?" And he said, "No, my name is James." And she said, "No, it's Michael, like from the Bible, the man who fights the devil." And from then on, he went by Michael. And he decided their last name should be Bear because that was one of his favorite animals. He told his daughter that God had given him a new name. Him and Susan traveled Europe for a year, going around and trying to teach people their religious ways of just basically mixing whatever bits of different religions they wanted, and this didn't really work. They were trying to get people to come and join them, to believe what they believed, but no one was really buying it at all. So after that, they decided to just go ahead and get married at Stonehenge in the moonlight. And in 1980, they returned to San Francisco, California. They continued practicing their own twisted form of religion, and they were doing plenty of drugs. And by this point, Michael's first wife, Lynn, had cut off all contact with him, between him and his own daughter, saying that he was too dangerous, that she feared for her daughter's safety. She even moved several different times. She cut off any acquaintances that knew both her and Michael, and just completely didn't want anything to do with him. Because, you see, Michael and Susan, by this point, they were selling drugs, they were living a very rough lifestyle, and that's what they chose to do. And then they started acting on their belief that they needed to rid the world of witches, and that is when they met Karen Barnes. Karen was so intrigued by them, offering them her home to stay in, but this cute little family environment would quickly change because Susan believed that Karen, because she was so intimidating and she was so beautiful, basically, that she was a witch and needed to be killed. Now, this is what Susan told Michael, because Michael would listen to anything that Susan were to say. But it's thought that possibly Susan was just intimidated by Karen, and she just wanted her gone. She returned from hitchhiking in a rainstorm and said that she had gotten a vision that she needed to immediately return home and end the life of her roommate. It was said they believed that Karen was a psychic vampire witch, but it's speculated that was just because she wouldn't enter a polyamorous relationship with the other two. So in March of 1981, Susan told Michael to hit her over the head with a frying pan as she made a snack, and when that didn't kill her, they stabbed her 13 times. They then fled to Oregon, where they found a little abandoned mountain shack, and they thought it was paradise, but it was really very disgusting and filled with drugs and just filth while they were there. They began calling themselves Muslim assassins and were planning to kill more witches. But after being in his cabin for a few weeks, they were running out of food and drugs, and so Michael actually took a trip to LA to get some more supplies. While he was gone, it took a few weeks to gather everything, and Susan was going crazy. Even more than usual. She was having these delusions that witches were everywhere. By the time Michael got back, a ranger actually found them in the home and forced them out, and they decided to go on the run once again. But on May 22nd, they actually found not only a ride, but a place to stay. The driver said that they could live in his treehouse in the Makenna wilderness, and he would soon regret that offer. Susan, by this time, was becoming so manic that she would just smile and laugh at the most inappropriate times. It was so incredibly creepy. She would just have this full-on smile that made you just have chills all the way up your spine, and eventually the driver that had invited them there kicked them out because he couldn't handle it anymore. But they weren't just going to go willingly. First, they robbed the house, and then they set it on fire. They fled again, and by May of 1982, they happened upon Alder Point, California, where they came across a marijuana farm. They got jobs there, and they were just going to hide out in a little secluded community, thinking everything would be fine. But their co-workers were very suspicious of them because Michael and Susan were very strange people. The workers described them as crazy anarchists who believed a nuclear apocalypse would occur soon. They just really thought that they were insane. Then they met Clark Stevens, who was a friend of the owner of this farm who would come and help out occasionally, and he was a heavy drinker and a very loud talker, and because of this, Michael and Susan believed that he was disrespectful towards God and was obviously a witch who needed to be killed. The fight between them all began between Clark and Michael, and they were arguing about how to tend the plants, and that is when Susan ordered Michael to kill Clark. So a few days later, while they were all out in the middle of nowhere tending the plants, Michael brought out a pistol and used 2 expired bullets to shoot him in the head. So no dogs could sniff out the body. They covered it in manure and they burned the body before hiding the remains. Now this didn't really work because a few days after that, a dog was spotted playing with what was believed to be a ball. but upon closer inspection was actually a human skull. The police went out and searched the area where they found the remains. Not only did they find the remains, under the body was his wallet, so they identified him very quickly. But the killers had vanished once again. But they were on the road in Trinity County, California, when there was a search happening for a missing hitchhiker, and they were so paranoid by this point that they believed this search was looking for them, when in fact it was for this missing hitchhiker. And so they ditched their car, they dropped their packs, and they ran for it. Michael ran for Los Angeles, and Susan ran deeper into the woods. When police were doing the search, of course, they came across these bags, and in Michael's bag were bullets, an ID that was stolen from a man named Richard Arata, and a manuscript titled A Cry for War, which listed a whole bunch of government officials, huge up in the government, that he wanted to kill, a hit list. And two of the names were Ronald Reagan and Johnny Carson. And it was thought that those two especially needed to be killed in their eyes, because both their first, middle, and last names had 6 letters in it, meaning their names were 666. Fingerprints were taken from this manuscript, and of course the FBI got involved because this is such big, accusations on these huge government officials. At this point, Michael was actually being picked up in LA for a rape charge. Like I told you before, he had been thought to be a rape suspect, so he was in their custody already and they didn't know it. But when they picked him up, he actually still had the gun on him that he used in Clark Stevens' murder. He hid it in his crotch, and apparently whoever searched him didn't look there, and so he still had it when they put him in the back of the police car, and so he hid it in the back seat. When they brought him in, he used the names on his fake ID, Richard Arata, as his name, and then they let him go. And that is when they found the gun he'd stashed and knew they messed up. They put out an APB on him, but they used his fake name because they hadn't yet connected with the other officers, knowing that his real name wasn't Richard. But shortly after, the officers who had found his pack recognized his name on this APB, or the stolen ID's name on the APB, and then the mugshot was sent over, and the people who worked at the farm with Clark Stevens identified him as Michael Bear, or Michael Carson. Although they knew that these were all connected, they had let him go, and he had actually went on to meet up with Susan at their designated meetup area. They began driving all over together, just trying to get away. They ended up staying with a friend in Oregon until this friend finally kicked them out, saying, "You've overstayed your welcome, get out." And they had already stolen a .38 pistol from them, and so they were on their way once again, but they were having a really hard time getting picked up hitchhiking, until a pickup truck driver very kindly turned around and picked them up. John parked and asked them if they needed a ride. They got in, but before they did, Susan had looked at Michael and said, "He is a witch, and we're going to need to kill him." And once they got in, he was listening to country music, and Susan didn't like that, and she complained about it, and they were arguing about it, and finally she just sat up and looked over at Michael, and Michael knew what he had to do. That's when he lifted the gun to John's head. But since John had pulled over and caused such a huge scene, there were lots of witnesses, and they were caught. Eventually, after the high-speed chase, of course. But once they were caught at the pre-trial, Michael admitted to killing Clark Stevens and John Hillier, but claimed self-defense. Susan stayed silent next to him the entire time, and Michael finally confessed to another murder, a San Francisco murder, but he just did that because he wanted more publicity. He said he would admit to the murder if he could have a press conference. And so they gave it to him, and he admitted to the murder of Karen Barnes. It was 6 hours long of him just mumbling about his religious practices, wanting to spew his views on everybody else. And he did this for 6 hours with Susan just sitting there smiling next to him. He expressed no remorse when he said that he killed Karen Barnes because she had put a hex on Susan because she was a witch. And he said he hit her over the head with a frying pan, and then he stabbed her twice. but that left 11 unaccounted for stab wounds. But after all of that, in June of 1984, they had the audacity to plead not guilty to Karen Barnes' murder. But on June 2nd, they were sentenced to 25 years to life in her murder, and the next year they were sentenced the same for Clark Stevens, and 2 years after that, the same for John Hillier. Susan screamed, "What is my crime? To be beautiful? To be an artist?" And Michael screamed, "Death to the Queen, long live the IRA." That's what they screamed when they got their sentences, but they still went to prison. And Michael still writes Susan letters. They were not supposed to be paroled until 2038, but in 2015, they were almost released. You see, California was allowing inmates over 60 a chance at early parole because prisons were so overcrowded. But Michael, who was 64, refused to even start the parole process because he said he was not guilty for killing witches, and he stood by that. He said he did no wrong and he wasn't going to say he did. Susan, who is 73, didn't initially say no to it. But there was a media frenzy once people heard that she could possibly get out and wanted to get out, and eventually she just recanted her interest in getting out at all. But something I wanted to throw in here was some statements from Michael or James's daughter, Jessica, because we often forget with the families of serial killers that they often don't know why their family member did that, or they definitely don't feel the same way or act the same way just because they have the same genes. And her statements really do make you believe that, because you do forget in these cases that there can be families that they have at home that have no idea. Jessica was just a little girl when her father started dating Susan, and she said he changed completely. He wasn't attentive or caring anymore. He used to braid her hair, read her books, and now he wouldn't even look at her. She said that going over to her stepmother's house before they completely cut ties with him altogether was like a horror movie. She said there was no furniture, there was just tall trees everywhere. She laid on a sleeping bag. She said she barely got fed while she was there because they were always just passed out naked on their bed, and she tried to wake them up, but they wouldn't. The final straw and why they eventually just cut off all connection with them is because Jessica finally told her mother that Susan had called her a demon and said that she needed to die. And one night when Jessica asked her father to give her back rub, Susan came in and scratched her back really hard. And when her mother looked at her back, she had giant gashes, bloody, on her back from what Susan had done. After that, her mother told her she would never have to see them again, and they didn't. But after they were caught, Jessica found newspaper articles about her own father and what he had done, and she was trying to read it out. She didn't even know how to read big words yet. She was trying to read out words like bludgeoned and decapitated, just sounding them out because she didn't even know what they were. She was completely horrified that her father could kill anyone, and it made her almost paranoid because if her own father could do it, so could anybody else. And it was just heartbreaking reading what she also went through as well, because you can't even imagine what a loved one all of a sudden being this evil monster can do to you. And I really felt like her part of the story needed to be told as well, because it's not her fault. And her own family on her mother's side even made her feel bad that that was her father when she couldn't have prevented that. But I have some questions for you. Do you think that Susan's visions were real at all? Or do you think it was just a ploy to get Michael to do whatever she wanted? I think that she could probably have gotten Michael to do whatever she wanted regardless, but I think a lot of the time she didn't get these inklings that, oh, they're witches. I think that she was insecure about, their position, or she just felt the need, an urge to get rid of them. I don't think that she was so out of it like she wanted everybody to believe. I think she knew exactly what she was doing, and I think Michael did too, but he was going to do anything for her. And do you think that if Michael never met Susan that he would have turned out a killer? Or do you think that he would have, possibly gone down a dark path, but not that? I definitely think she has a huge part in why he turned out this way, but you never know. I mean, if he could kill, does that mean that he would have on his own? I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one down below. I thought it was really crazy and the perfect one to start out our Foul Play February with. I hope you were excited as I am to hang out all month long because I'm so excited to read your comments and to just interact with you all month. I really love the connection that we have, and I just feel like you guys are so appreciative and you're so deserving of it. So I want to give back to you guys. And don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye. It baffles me that there are people who think they can get to decide who lives or dies.